and welcome to Worlds Apart. With several military offensives underway in Syria, Iraq and Yemen, the MENA region is going through one of its most turbulent phases in decades. Does the shift from proxy war to more direct engagement indicate the players' desire to shift the conflicts towards a resolution, or on the contrary, the desire to keep up the fight? Well, to discuss that, I'm now joined by Egypt's former foreign minister, Nabil Fahmy. Mr. Fahmy, thank you very much for your time. It's great to see you in Moscow again.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
As I said, there are several military operations underway in the region, in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, and all of that is changing the nature of regional tensions from covert to more overt. Do you see that as a positive or negative development?
It's both, frankly. There's no question that when you have so many military operations with states directly involved, that there's a very big danger here. So from that respect, and as a human being, one has to look at this and really be worried. On the other hand, I think bringing things out in the open places not only obligations but responsibilities on everybody's shoulders. Let's be straightforward about this, but I really would hope that this new posture reflects an understanding that things have not gone well for whoever has an agenda, that things will not be resolved through third parties, and that one needs to get directly engaged, preferably in diplomacy.
Well, for years and years, we heard the calls of, for all those players to come together, to sit at the table and work out some diplomatic solution. And the reason why those calls were not heeded was because everybody thought that they have other indirect ways of influencing the situation. So if you take that as a starting point, perhaps that shows that the proxy war hasn't been successful. But do you think it's realistic to expect that, by the virtue of putting resources on the ground, that there would be some more urgency of finding a solution? Do you think that would push the conflict towards a settlement, or rather towards increasing stakes even higher?
It's very difficult to say, because on the one hand, I agree with your last point, this will increase the stakes. States will be held accountable by their own people for losses from their own military or civilians and so on. So that's on the one hand. Mistakes by countries can have very difficult and very serious reactions from other countries. Especially when you have the major regional powers and also, frankly, superpowers engaged on this. So the stakes are much higher than before. I honestly believe there's no clear military solution to any of this, although I do support use of force against terrorists very clearly. That being said, it has to be coupled with diplomacy. The problems we're facing in the Middle East now are basically results of two deficits in the region. One is a managing change deficit. We've been very bad at managing change, which is natural. Change will happen. The world is changing. But secondly, because there was an overdependence on foreign powers on issues of national security, what has happened is that regional and international agenda were superimposed on domestic agendas.
Now, I think in this very complex tangle that you just described, Egypt has a somewhat curious position. You have no obvious friends, you have no obvious enemies, and I think that's a direct result of the foreign policy line that you articulated when you came to office back in July of 2013. You said back then that Egypt would pursue multiple partnerships, but it didn't want to be constrained by one single alliance structure. 3 years on, how do you see this strategy playing out?
I think it's a two-pronged strategy. One is to expand your network, and that's succeeded. The other is to move vertically by putting actual proposals on the table. In other words, concrete diplomatic activities.
When you articulated that multidimensional foreign policy, you also said that it wasn't the choice of one at the expense of another. You wanted to expand your options, and I think some countries, the Russians, the Americans, they can object to that, but they can understand that. But what about your Gulf neighbors? Because they seem to be far more emotionally attached to this notion of Arab unity. Do you think they can understand your rationalizations about your national interests?
First, it's important for us to enunciate those rationalizations clearly and make it clear exactly what's on our minds so that when we take actions, they're not surprised. And I will give you a specific example that was of concern in the Gulf states. In 2013, when President Obama wanted to bomb Syria, Egypt, personally, I stood up and said we will not support bombing Syria. It was not well received. It was not, expected in some Arab countries. But we didn't simply announce it. We consulted with them, we told them, we explained why, and we were still suffering, and we are to this day, from the repercussions of what happened in Libya, of not knowing the day after the bombing. So we explained that. That's part of diplomacy. I still believe there's clearly misunderstandings and some tension between Egypt and some of the Arab countries now. But I'm not really worried about the relationship long term. I honestly believe that strategically, as our two countries change, there will be some rough spots on the way as we get more accustomed to, but strategically, we understand the importance of the relationship with the Arab Gulf and with North Africa. And I think they understand that as well.
Well, I hope it's mutual. And speaking about rough spots, the last time the UN Security Council had to vote on Syria, Egypt supported both the Russian and the French resolutions, which drew sharp criticism from your Saudi colleagues. And the Saudi envoy to the United Nations put it in a very interesting, to me, like in a very interesting linguistic way. He said that non-Arab countries have proven much closer to the so-called Arab consensus than Egypt. And that immediately brings to mind the idea of the Washington consensus. As somebody who worked for 9 years as the Egyptian ambassador to the United States, which of these two consensuses is more unforgiving when you go your own way?
Well, it's a great question. And I've said this publicly back home in Egypt as well. Arabs need to define the Arab consensus in the 21st century, which is different from the Arab consensus in the 20th century, which was originally against European colonialism, and then the Arab-Israeli conflict, and so on and so forth. So we need to define our vision of the Arab world. It doesn't have to be identical in every Arab country, but there will be more commonalities than not. I think there is an Arab consensus in support for keeping Syria unified, but there may not be an Arab consensus on the tactics to get there.
Now, let us develop this idea of the Arab consensus, because almost immediately after Egypt voted on that resolution, the Saudi oil giant Aramco said that they're not going to supply Egypt with subsidized petroleum products. The amount of denigrating comments vis-a-vis Egypt on some Saudi networks has also increased. And to us Russians, that looks very familiar. I mean, this is exactly what Americans do every time they don't like something that we do. So there would be economic sanctions, there would be an increased political and diplomatic shaming. Don't you think that perhaps Saudi Arabia perceives Arab consensus in the same way that Washington perceives it's a consensus, and that it uses the same playbook of sanctions, economic and diplomatic pressure for those who dare to defy it?
I think there's some truth to what you're saying in terms of the examples, but there's also some gray areas in the detail of what happened exactly and why. There is clearly a difference of opinion between Egypt and Saudi Arabia on the issue of Syria. There's no doubt about that, and let's not beat around the bush, frankly. This is one example of the rough spots, but I do believe we will get over this because our interest in preserving the Arab identity are much greater than the difference that exists now. But this is one of the rough spots.
Now, Mr. Fahmy, I think this question of geopolitical entitlement and power projection is at the root of many of the region's conflicts. Let's take Iran, for example. I heard you say that you're ready to engage with Iran on a national level, you're ready to compete with them, but you resent their posture as a defender of Shias in the region. Can you dissuade Iran from doing that, from posturing like that, given what the Gulf and especially the Saudis have been doing vis-a-vis the Sunnis? Haven't they been spreading their influence extraterritorially much more than the Iranians?
I wouldn't agree that the Saudis have projected their support internationally more than, or regionally or internationally, frankly, more than.
Are you kidding? Well, look at their support of the, certain types of Islam.
Let me just continue. I'm talking here about political support. You're talking about Sunni Shia, and I'll answer that. But what I'm saying is that Iran has been quite aggressive in the Middle East in its foreign policy. The reason I draw a distinction is, for the answer I gave you in the first question, I think the Arab world has a job to do in explaining its vision for the 21st century. I don't agree that we should define our future on Sunni, Shia, Kurdish, Yazdi, Durzi, or anything. We should focus on the nation-state basis. We cannot divide the Middle East, again, based on an ethnic basis. What will happen is we will be inconsistent with the international system. Our system is based on states. So do we have work to do? Yes, we do. But I don't agree that anybody should project anybody. And we don't do that back home either. You can support or criticize our policies, but we intentionally refrain from saying we are this kind of Muslim or that kind of Muslim. I will continue to urge all states, Arab and non-Arab, to talk to each other about their successes or differences as states, not about leaders of Sunni or Shia.
Well, Minister, we have to take a very short break now, but when we come back, finding a balance between state and religion has always been a challenge in the region. The excesses of secularism have been blamed for the rise of Islamism and vice versa. Why is it so hard to find the golden mean? That's coming up in a moment on Worlds Apart. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Worlds Apart, where we're discussing state and religion in the Middle East and North Africa with Egypt's former foreign minister, Nabil Fahmy. Mr. Fahmy, the first move of the Sisi government that you served of late was to declare the Muslim Brotherhood a terrorist organization. Many of its members are imprisoned or in exile. And this is a very complicated question in your region, I understand that, but do you think the designation, the terrorist designation, was a smart move to begin with, especially given everything that you say about inclusivity and the, trying to build unity within your society?
Let me just clarify. The decision taken to place the Muslim Brotherhood on the terrorist list in Egypt was done by the government before President Sisi, when the president was Minister of Defense at the time. But anyway, the important thing is the question you're asking. For me, any group, individual that puts its national identity ahead of its ideology takes the first step towards being part of the political system in the country. Secondly, it has to refrain from exercising its opposition violently. The problem, frankly, with the Muslim Brotherhood was it was becoming violent on the street. And secondly, it actually puts the ideology before the nation.
I understand that, but...
That's the difference. Now, in terms of how we move forward, well, we have a constitution. Anybody who wants to respect the constitution can find his place, but he has to seriously respect that. And there is this tension between what people like to call, imprecisely, political Islam generally, and secular governance. I am somebody who supports secular governance because it includes everybody.
That's why I'm asking you. Again, I understand everything that you're saying, but you also understand that this is an organization that has been part and parcel of your society for many, many decades. When you designate it as terrorists, do you think it's helpful in trying to modulate their actions and trying to encourage the political transition?
Two things. First of all, you forget after June 30th, 2013, the new government that was formed actually invited the Brotherhood to join, and they refused. So they weren't designated as terrorists immediately after those events. They were designated after violence on the street. If you pursue violence, there will be legal measures.
Now, some of the harshest criticism on how the Sisi government dealt with the Muslim Brotherhood came from Turkey, which since then has imprisoned tens of thousands of its own citizens without even much pretense at due process, also accusing them of terrorist activity without much evidence, so far at least. I wonder what you see as the root cause of the Turkish purge. Is it political, is it sectarian, or is it strictly personal?
I'm not a Turkish expert, but I would lean towards power politics and personalities, because these are two Islamic groups. The majority party has an Islamic background, and the Gül'ün party is also...
Well, they're not a party, the movement.
Yeah, I mean, in other words, they're two Islamist movements, so it's not a conflict between secularism and Islam. This is about power and possibly also about personalities. The point, as much as we follow what's happening around the world, we have no interest, nor do we have the ability, frankly, to influence domestic affairs in every country in the world. We will give you advice, but you can do what you want to do in your own country, as long as that doesn't affect foreign policy. So, for me, what happens in Turkey, I have an opinion on it. But I will not make a judgment. And I don't accept them making a judgment on what happens in
But that doesn't stop them from making judgment or giving asylums to many of the Muslim Brotherhood members. But I think Turkish trajectory has been worse, and not only domestically, but also internationally, because they played a rather questionable role in Syria. They are continuing to play a role in Iraq. The way they engage Europe and the United States, to us Russians, that's quite unprecedented. Now, you know that the Kremlin is trying to build or develop a pragmatic relationship, an emotionless relationship with the current Turkish leadership. Do you think that's possible in principle? And I want a direct and honest answer from you.
For it to be possible, there has to be movement on both sides. If Turkey is simply trying to project its national interest, then countries should deal with it in realpolitik. If Turkey is trying to project itself ideologically, then there's a problem. So I can agree and disagree with Turkey as a state, but the problem that exists between Turkey and Egypt, for example, the present government in Turkey, is they projected themselves as the model for political Islam, the bridge between the West and the rest of it. So what happened in Egypt for them was the end of the dream, and that's what created the problem. But I am one of the proponents of a serious dialogue between Egypt and Turkey. But I don't expect that to happen at all if there is not a priori a clear commitment not to interfere in the internal affairs of each side. But if you're going to try to create a system where it doesn't involve nation states and it has ideology as the basis, what happens to the others who don't believe in this?
Well, Turkey remains quite involved in other states' affairs. One example would be in Syria, and this is something that I want to ask you about. I know that you've been fairly critical on the Assad government for the brutal use of force and for not responding to people's calls for reform quickly enough. Now, I think Egypt also has had its fair share of similar problems, albeit on a smaller level. But do you think if Assad stepped down, if he had stepped down the same year that Mubarak and Gaddafi stepped down, do you think the region would have been in better shape now?
Let me answer it differently. At the very beginning of this problem, the Arab League sent an Arab force to a peacekeeping force in Syria, led by a Sudanese general who was a very tough military man. Had the international community paid attention then, with the regional powers and the superpowers, we could have managed the situation and had the transition peacefully. Problem, people missed the opportunity because it was not on the top of their agenda. Let me answer your question directly. I don't think we can ignore what happened in Syria over the last 5 years. At the same time, and therefore we need to have a new Syria in practice and in many respects. If you're going to have new practices, you have new people. But the new people, that's the Syrian choice. It's not anybody else's choice. My priority in getting to, nevertheless, is what ensures the stable transition and the preservation of the Syrian state. That's my priority.
But you know that the Syrian Army, the very crucial institution at this point of time, is for better or for worse devoted to the current president. I mean, I traveled with them. I know that many soldiers have his pictures on their cell phones. But this question of the use of force by the state is very important here. And 5 years into this conflict, we now have the Russians using air power in Syria. We have the Americans and the Iraqis moving on Mosul using air bombardments. We have the Saudi-led campaign in Yemen, of which Egypt is part of, also not doing cognitive therapy there. It's a hard use of military force. Isn't it a bit disingenuous to criticize Assad so much when everybody else, when faced with the same challenges, are essentially resorting to the same means?
No, I don't think that it's all the same. But first of all, secondly, I didn't criticize Assad for defending his country. I criticized Assad for what he did towards his own people. That was my criticism. And there is a problem of governance and management of change that I said applies throughout the Middle East. And frankly, many of the countries playing in the region, there are questionable issues about why they're actually moving in this. If you look, you mentioned Turkey. Turkey is one example. There's no question that the Turkish borders were the easiest access for ISIS and ISIL, whatever you want to call it.
And I suspect that it wasn't just passive support
exactly.
in that sense.
And now you see clearly the Turkish focus is on, the Kurdish issue much more than the Syrian issue. And there seems to be some territorial interest from Turkey in both Syria and Iraq.
Well, they call it emotional attachment, I think, now.
And now also to Iraq. So that again raises questions. That being said, things happened in Syria, and we need to move on. I need to look for a political consensus. That will mean compromises on both sides. I don't think that Assad leaving now is the answer, but I would be very, very surprised if at the end of the day we didn't see a new system.
Let me ask you very quickly, this week marks the 5th year since Muammar Gaddafi of Libya was murdered, and as much as we all may disapprove of him politically, I think you would agree that Libya as a country was a much more stable neighbor for Egypt than it is now. How big of a threat is it at this point of time?
It's a potential catastrophe for Egypt. Our western border, which we secure, and presently now with the General Haftar, Haftar on the opposite side, is costing us tremendous amount of assets and attention and money to do that. You want a stable state as your neighbor. The fact is, what happened in Libya is a reflection of tactical steps without strategic vision. If you're going to use force anywhere, it has to be coupled immediately with political attention and a clear plan for the day after. What happened in Libya was they went after Gaddafi and then they left it to anybody who could get guns and money. So even a country like Egypt, which is its neighbor, it's finding tremendous difficulty defining who actually are the effective players in the Libyan case, and there's no institution. It's going to be a nation-state building process. It will take time.
Now, speaking about this interplay of tactical and strategic, as far as I understand, Egypt's current strategy vis-à-vis Libya focuses on border security. You do not want to get involved militarily. Is that because you don't believe that military action could be effective at this point of time, or is it perhaps because you believe that the dust of war in Libya can settle on its own within, like, let's say, 5 or 10 years?
No, it's belief. I think it's both realistic but also emotional. We have a strong belief that if you spill blood, people don't forget. So we don't want to really use force in our neighboring states, because that will leave a long-term bad feeling between neighbors. That's really why we're not interfering. We are using force minimally on the border when we have to. We can argue with our neighbors, but to actually...
Is it sustainable, that strategy, though?
It's sustainable to defend the border. It's not sustainable to create a state. And in Libya, my proposal now, frankly, is we need to enhance the Libyan authorities' capacity to manage the country and to secure the borders, and therefore establish a UN, Arab League, African Union force not to manage Libya, just to secure the borders. That should be a first step towards the creation of a state.
But Mr. Fahmy, as somebody who was on the ground in Libya 5 years ago, it's simply tragic for me to hear how drastically the global community's objectives and attention to that country changed, because what we had 5 years ago was definitely not perfect, but what you're talking about now is simply a catastrophe, the way you put it.
There's no question it's a catastrophe. The decision to accept bombing Libya was an anti-Qaddafi reflection. It was not, however, a wise decision because it wasn't complete.
And it wasn't for the sake of the Libyan people. That's the tragedy of it. It didn't benefit anyone.
Because they didn't have the day after. The issue is force should always be the last resort, but it's not an end in itself. It's a tool towards an objective. Nobody seemed to have the clear objective the day after.
Okay, well, Mr. Fahmy, we have to leave it there. I only hope that, in the way we pursue other conflicts, that objective will be there on the table. But anyway, we have to leave it there. Thank you for being here, and I encourage our viewers to leave comments on our Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube pages. And I hope to see you again, same place, same time, here on Worlds Apart.